Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. There's an interesting conversation going on between climate alarmists on Twitter today. Eric Holthaus wrote, "I wonder how many hundreds of times Seth Borenstein has cited Michael Mann over the years. Get some new sources." That seems like a pretty reasonable request since they claim that 97% of the world's scientists support their position. But Michael Mann got very angry at the suggestion that the press should talk to someone else besides him. He said that the suggestion to diversify was a bomb-throwing attack. And Seth Borenstein, who's never interviewed anyone who tells the truth about climate, responded. He wrote, "I strive to include diverse scientific voices in asking for comments." And to be fair, Seth Borenstein has spoken to other climate scientists who are almost as bad as Michael Mann. In 2008, he quoted NASA's James Hansen saying the Arctic would be free of ice in 5 to 10 years. A year earlier, Seth Borenstein predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2012. But back to the conversation on Twitter, a NASA climate scientist weighed in. "We no longer live in a stable climate. The instability is worsening quickly. This should terrify everyone alive." And was all brought to you by the fossil fuel industry, which is known for decades and did what it could to stop any action. The climate never was stable, and it's pretty ridiculous that a climate scientist could believe something so absurd. And as far as the fossil fuel companies go, they're the people who provide the energy which keeps billions of people alive from day to day. If their product got cut off, not very many people would be alive for very long. Peter Kalmus would be pretty terrified if he couldn't get the energy he needed to heat his home. And then somebody else weighed in. "Okay, here's what just happened. Australia just hit 50°C for the first time in 24 years. Such readings are rare historically, but now more likely. Marty in Western Australia reached 50.5 degrees Celsius. That was Australia's second hottest temperature on record. Record is 50.7 degrees Celsius. Now let's look at what's actually going on in Australia besides people running around wearing masks in the rain. Peter Hannam is a leading climate alarmist journalist in Australia. 5 years ago I had the good fortune to get to make fun of him live and in person in the Australian Parliament House. He said it was Australia's coolest year in the past 10 and no region of the country was in drought at the end of the year. That description doesn't sound much like a climate that's on fire. Anthony Sharwood claimed that the record high temperature in Australia was 50.7 degrees Celsius, but that simply isn't true. In 1995, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology showed a 52.8 degrees Celsius reading at Bourke on January 17, 1877. They showed a 50.8 degree reading at Mildura on January 6, 1906. They showed a 53.1 degree reading at Cloncurry on January 16, 1889. And they showed a 50.7 degree reading at Eucla on January 22, 1906. Australia had much hotter temperatures during the 19th century, but the Bureau of Meteorology has erased them since 1995. All 4 of these records I've highlighted have since been disappeared by the Australian government. So Anthony Sharwood's "What Just Happened" was actually much ado about nothing. And this NASA climate scientist claims that we used to have a stable climate. Well, let's take a look at the climate of 1898. Australia had their worst drought on record from 1892 to 1903, the Federation drought. The population of sheep in Australia dropped in half during that time, and the population of cattle dropped by 40%. Australia was suffering terrible brush fires during February 1898. At the same time, New Zealand was having terrible fires as well. Tasmania and southern Australia were having terrible fires, while Queensland was flooded. One of the deadliest typhoons on record struck the Philippines, killing at least 7,000 people. Oregon set their all-time temperature record of 119 degrees that summer, actually reaching that temperature twice. More than 2/3 of U.S. states reached higher temperatures during 1898 than they did during this past year, which was advertised as a record heat wave. The heat wave of 1898 went from coast to coast and was very deadly. Almost every state reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer of 1898. Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania were all on fire during February 1898, which is not that unusual because it's their summer. Incredibly, though, at the same time, the United States was having one of its largest forest fires on record in the middle of winter. On February 16, 1898, most of 3 million acres of forest burned up in South Carolina in just a few hours. This fire was unprecedented, and it's pretty remarkable that it was occurring at exactly the same time as the fires in the southern hemisphere. If climate scientists were actual scientists, they would want to understand what was going on rather than simply erasing it from the record. Later that year in 1898, Colorado had their largest fires on record, with most of the northwest quadrant of the state on fire. During the spring of 1898, there were huge forest fires in Northern California, and in the autumn there were huge forest fires in Wisconsin. Also in the spring of 1898, Southern California was having huge fires. This is very unusual for California to be dry in April. Most years, California is very green in April, and their fire season doesn't start till much later. Climate alarmists keep claiming that the fire season is getting longer, but in 1898 it was occurring all year long. Huge fires in Wisconsin during October, and huge fires in Kansas and Oklahoma during November. The climate was never stable, and it's pretty remarkable that a NASA climate scientist could be that clueless. This person has no clue what he's talking about. If anything, the climate is more stable now than it was during the 19th century. The climate scam depends entirely on shutting down the voices of anyone who tells the truth. If journalists interviewed people who told the truth about climate, their scam would start winding down quickly. That's why they don't do it. And Seth Borenstein's reliance on #1 climate fraudster Michael Mann is very telling. Michael Mann refuses to debate climate skeptics, and he also appears to be very afraid of competition within his own ranks. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this scam for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Curie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.